The Terrifying Lies Podcast, with music and stories by Craig Nybo. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Terrifying Lies Podcast. I'm your host, Craig Nybo. After a long break, we're finally back with a brand new season. Welcome to Season 5. It's great to be with you again, and I've got something special lined up. But before we dive into today's tale, I'd like to ask you a quick favor. You see, Terrifying Lies takes tons of effort to produce, and you can help keep it going. If you've got a few seconds to spare and are feeling extra generous, here's how you can lend a hand. First, tell your friends on social media that we're back. It's the perfect time to get into the show. Maybe even let them know why you listen. Second, and this is super important, leave a positive review wherever you tune in, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pod Republic, wherever. Those reviews are the lifeblood of this show. They'll help it reach new listeners. If you enjoy what you hear, please talk about it. One last thing before we jump in. If you really love the show and want to support it, consider becoming a backer. Head over to patreon.com/terrifyinglies and chip in. Even $1 a month, just $12 a year, makes a big difference. Now, onward and upward. I'm thrilled to be back and even more thrilled that you've decided to join me. Let me tell you about today's story. Many years ago, I started a podcast called Harrowing Tales. It's long gone now, though someone else seems to be using the name. Back then, I wrote a 10-part story called Funk Toast and the Pan-Galactic Prom Show. It's the closest thing I've ever written to an autobiography. And by closest, I mean not close at all. The name Funk Toast came from a real band I played in decades ago. Funny thing is, many of the guys I played with back then, I still play with today. As I wrote the fictional characters with our names, new ideas popped into my head. Ideas for more stories in the same universe. I ended up writing 3 of them and bundling them into a book. For this season, I've decided to unzip those 3 stories and give you one of them. It's got nothing to do with the band Funk Toast, though. Who knows? I might go there eventually. Instead, it's a wild science fiction romp written in the spirit of Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I put a lot of care into producing it, and I think you're going to love it. One quick disclaimer before we start. I've decided to dip my toe into AI. Not for writing, never that. I won't compromise my art to a computer. And never for the songs at the ends of the episodes. Those will be all me, playing all the instruments and singing and writing the lyrics without ChatGPT's help. Thank you very much. But for some of the background music, I used AI to speed up production. I also experimented with a voice changer, so when you hear me reading a woman's lines, I'll sound female. Same goes for children's voices. It keeps my delivery and inflections intact, just with a little twist. If you can forgive me these indulgences, I think it'll make for a much better listening experience. This story is epic. It's going to take up all of Season 5. Writing it felt like binge eating a bag of candy, and I giggled the whole way through. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed creating it. Now, here we go. Part 1 of Rock and Roll and Resurrection. I'll see you on the other side. Black-clad security guards barely kept the fans back from Bieber's Cadillac just moments before the superstar died. Bieber smiled and waved at a sea of faces, early teenage girls from all over the region who had come for his stadium show and stayed for perhaps a glimpse of his beautiful face as he made his way from the venue to his limo. A pair of V-shaped guards wearing matching sunglasses and earpieces escorted the pop star through the crowd. More guards grunted it out against the crush of young, screaming girls. The teenagers reached, trying to touch the superstar as he moved through the gauntlet. Twana Birch stood back in the crowd, unable to elbow her way any closer. She could barely see the top of his head, crowned with magnificent chestnut hair. She wished so often, usually while looking at posters of him on her bedroom walls, that she could run her fingers through that hair. Now, with possibly her only chance ever to see him up close slipping away, she tried shoving her way through the gridlock. She feared she would never have another opportunity to touch him.
"Stay back,"
the guard shouted. Like the rest of the superfans assembled, she ignored his order. She just wanted to see Bieber. Why wouldn't they just let her see Bieber? She tried to push through again, but the girl in front of her, an overweight thing, shouldered her back, driving an elbow into Twana's face. Twana yelped, curled away, covering her nose. She would likely have a shiner. At that very moment, as she wondered how she would look all black and blue at school tomorrow, she heard the Cadillac door slam shut. Just like that, her chance of touching the most beautiful boy in the world was gone. Twana swore to herself and kicked the red-headed girl in the back of the leg.
Ow!
The redhead said, wheeling on Twana.
You ruined it for me, you big fat animal.
Twana shouted. The redhead laughed and drove her shoulder into Twana's face. That was when Bieber's limousine exploded. The bomb's shockwave washed through the crowd, shoving fans over and outward from ground zero. Even the burly guards fell over in the concussion. Wounded teenage girls screamed in the aftermath of the blast. Twana lay on the ground, the big redhead on top of her. Flying debris had opened a wound on the back of the redhead's scalp. She wailed and pressed a hand against the bleeding.
Are you all right?
Twana asked, her ears ringing so loudly that she felt she had to shout above their driving whine. Twana took off her scarf and handed it to the redhead. The girl took it and pressed it against the cut on the back of her skull.
"Everybody stay calm,"
someone shouted. Nobody listened. Once the car had gone up in flames, the throng of Bieber fans forgot about their idol. They forgot about what it did to them when he got up on the stage in the limelight, backed by a line of hip-hop dancers to belt out the lyrics of his super hit, Stand. Those on the outer fringe of the blast routed first. Those closer to ground zero struggled over each other, a clod of writhing bodies clamoring for purchase, for equilibrium. Twana lay on her belly and covered her head with her forearms. The redhead crawled over her and moved off with the rush of boots and sneakers. Someone stepped on the small of Twana's back. She ignored the pain and curled up. She couldn't stand up in the rumble. She couldn't even move from her position. She'd heard about people dying under the trampling feet of frenzied fans. She'd always wondered why someone in such a situation wouldn't just stand up and move with the flow. Now she understood. If Twana even uncurled from her defensive posture, she felt that those feet, those pumps, those boots, those heels, those sandals would all come down on her. They would break her bones and leave her dead. She felt she had a better chance of surviving if she remained right where she lay, curled in a fetal position on the sidewalk. Twana felt something beneath her, a small lump against her sternum. She worked her hand up underneath her weight and grabbed the little mass. She dragged it out from beneath her and moved it to where she could get a better look. When she finally recognized the thing for what it was, her lips pursed together and she issued a little mousy chirp. She felt bile rise from her belly and threatened to shoot out onto the concrete. She held a severed finger, its meaty end puckered with red tissue. She dropped the little member and curled away from it, but then something entered her mind, a memory that felt foreign in the rush of the panicked crowd. The finger had a birthmark just below the second knuckle, a birthmark shaped like a heart.
It can't be.
Twana said out loud and worked her way around so she could get a better look at the finger. Her suspicions proved correct. There, as plain as day, was the birthmark in question, shaped like a heart. She remembered reading an issue of Teen Beau a few weeks back about signature nuances of pop stars. She'd been particularly drawn to Bieber. When the reporter had asked him to disclose something about himself, something that nobody knew, Bieber had confessed about an odd birthmark on his left ring finger, just under the second knuckle, shaped like a heart. Twana had stored the interesting fact in a vault of almost limitless trivia she'd filed in her mind about Bieber. She put the severed appendage in her hip pocket and wrangled to a defensive turtle shell position, working against the mash of fleeing feet. She no longer worried about being trampled by hundreds of Bieber fans. She just haunched there, her hands over her head to protect her from the clomping, her face curled up into a grin. She'd come only to touch Bieber's hair, but she'd done much better than that. She'd caught Bieber's finger, and nobody would ever take it away from her. Tawana took the train home late that night. Cops and ambulances had come to the scene of the car bombing to see to the wounded and take down reports. The cops had requested that witnesses stay close by. Tawana knew that should they discover what she had found on the sidewalk, they would probably arrest her. So she slipped away without a word. She was entitled to the finger. She didn't plan to give it up. The train glided along its lonely track, rattling through the city down to the south end where houses stood like collapsing remnants of their former selves. It trundled by the projects, a collection of buildings that huddled against the rest of the world. Finally, it came to a stop at her station. The doors swooshed open. Tawana exited the train and walked into the night. Someone had tagged the cinder block walls again. It seemed the station administration had to bring in painters to whitewash over gang graffiti on almost a weekly basis these days. As she walked the platform, a luxury space bus passed overhead, closing in on the nearby spaceport. Tawana looked up at the craft. The transport undoubtedly carried hundreds of the most privileged, all spread out in their own private cabins, eating whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, as they returned from off-world exotic vacation spots. Tawana had never been near a space bus. The people who lived in her neighborhood would probably never venture beyond the borders of their own town, much less to the stars. The space bus slowed its approach and made its gradual descent toward the inner trans spaceport. Less than 5 miles away from the train station, Tawana swallowed her envy and continued her walk along the platform. She yawned. She wanted to go to bed. She got home late. Butch's car, slammed down Civic, sat at the curb in front of the house. She frowned. She'd forgotten that Butch had come home for a couple of days, ostensibly to visit Ma, but truthfully, he was probably lying low after some job he had pulled. She let herself in and went to her Bieber poster-festooned bedroom. With the door shut behind her, she took the severed finger out from her pocket and held it up in the light where she could get a good look at it. Such a small thing, insignificant really, but so valuable. If she wanted, she could have Butch sell it for her on the black market and make a fortune. But she wouldn't do that. Not to her precious love, Bieber. She had plans for the finger. Why have just the finger when I can have the whole thing? She thought, and smiled. Tawana went through a little makeup kit she kept on her dresser and found a nearly empty lipstick case. She wound out the rest of the red stick and used a tissue to pull it out of the case. She spent a few minutes cleaning out the tube with a paper towel. She hunted through a drawer full of junk in the top of her dresser until she found a gold heart pennant. She debated taking the little heart off the chain, then decided to leave it. She ran the gold chain through a loop in the lipstick case and hung it around her neck. She picked up the finger from her dresser and put it into the lipstick case. She snapped it closed and looked at herself in the mirror. The lipstick case dangled over her chest. She smiled at her reflection and turned to the side to look at her prize from another angle. Not losing her smile, she changed into her pajamas and went to bed. To Tawana, the apartment felt empty and cold every morning. She got up, put on jeans and a black t-shirt, went downstairs and made herself a bowl of cereal. Butch poked his head around the corner into the kitchen, his hair disheveled, his eyes puffy. He smiled.
Hey, sis.
Tawana granted him a snap of a glance. Butch took it as a welcoming gesture and ambled into the kitchen, wearing nothing but his boxer shorts. He poured himself a bowl of cereal and sat down across from her. He took a bite of his breakfast and got his first real look at his sister for the day. He dropped his spoon into his cereal bowl. His mouth flopped open. Tawana's eyes sheened black and blue. puffy and swollen. A narrow cut ran from her chin almost to her ear. She wore other bruises on her forearms. Butch's expression turned from raw surprise to anger.
"Who did this to you?"
he asked, balling up one of his hands into a fist.
Relax, Butchie.
Twana said, taking a bite of cereal.
Haven't you watched the news?
"What do you mean?"
Bieber's dead. Been blown to Kingdom Come. I was there.
"What?"
Crowd nearly trampled me. Wasn't their fault. They just wanted to get out of there.
Butch stood from the breakfast table and moved across the kitchen to the little television set mounted into the wall. He snicked it on, flipped through the channels until he came to a morning news program. Sure enough, a newsreel ran from the concert venue where Bieber had played just the night before. A burned-out limo sat behind the venue, surrounded by a police line. A team of forensic investigators crawled over the scene, exploring the area for clues. The newscaster droned on.
Bieber is dead. That's what the headlines say this morning as the remains of his limousine smolder in the morning light. In the middle of a large gathering of Bieber fans last night, his car exploded, sending shrapnel through the crowd. Although there were no fatalities, many have been treated for injuries in the blast and in the subsequent panic that resulted. Early this morning, this tape was released to the internet from Brennan Nix, former member of the Five Fingers, Bieber's previous boy band.
A clip of the Five Fingers performing came on screen. The five boys, all better looking than one another, graced an audience of mostly early teen girls with their mega hit, Caught in the Act. Twana liked the Five Fingers okay, but she'd always felt that Bieber hadn't bloomed until he had struck out on his own. After a few seconds of the Five Fingers, Brendan Nix's face came on screen. His video, shot with a webcam, caught him in poor light. His bedraggled face appeared drawn, traced with lines. Nix seemed to have aged 15 years since the boy band had broken up. The former pop star had shaved his head and now had tattoos, a tear under one eye, a flourish of thorns around his neck and ducking into the collar of his shirt. Nix had always been the bad boy of the Five Fingers. Twana realized as she looked at his tired face that the bad boy rebel thing probably hadn't been just an act.
I know that for what I've done, a lot of people are gonna hate me. I'm cool with that.
Nix said, snide smile hunching just below the surface.
But I want you so-called Bieber fans to know that you've been wronged. While Bieber always put on that surgically corrected smile and chirped on with his prepubescent voice telling you to stand, what you didn't know is he never stood for anything. He's a selfish, arrogant, spoiled child who always got whatever he wanted. Wherever he went, he left ruin. So you might hate me now, but whether you know it or not, I've done the world a favor by getting rid of Bieber.
With that, Nick shoved off from his desk and slid out into the middle of the room. He wore a t-shirt, the likes of which Twana had seen at school on kids who didn't understand what Bieber was about. Nick's shirt read, "I love to hate Bieber." Twana lost her appetite. She put her spoon down and clenched her teeth. She touched the little lipstick case hanging beneath her t-shirt and thought about all the Bieber songs she would never hear because selfish old Brennan Nix had killed him.
"Relax, sis,"
Butch said.
"He's just a pipsqueak."
How could you say that?
Twana said. The television report flipped to a shot of police escorting Nix from his apartment, cuffed and grinning, to a police cruiser. An officer held his hands up in front of the camera, trying to block Nix from making a statement to the press.
"Look,"
Butch said, recoiling.
"I know you really liked his music. I'm sorry you had to be there when his car blew."
Twana and Butch finished breakfast in silence. The television news program droned on. In national news, illegal cloning was on the rise. A photograph of Orlando DePescio came on screen. The portly man stood outside a high-rise from which he conducted business. The reporter questioned him about allegations of DePescio's involvement in illegal cloning.
Hey, isn't that your boss?
Twana said in an accusing tone, nodding toward the news report. Butch snapped off the television and smiled at his little sister.
"That ain't nothing you have to know about."
Whatever,
Twana said, picking up her bowl to drink off the sugary milk. After breakfast, Twana walked down the hall of their little apartment and stood at the door of her ma's room. She looked into the dim, at the slight lump of her ma's body beneath a pair of ropey blankets. Like every morning, Twana's ma stayed in bed, recovering from whatever she had taken the night before. Butch worked for the man who supplied most of the drugs to the neighborhood. Twana resented that, even though Butch claimed he never dealt. Twana tiptoed into the room and kissed her ma's tallow head, causing her to stir in her sleep.
I'm gonna make it right, Ma,
Twana said, stroking her hair. She'd lost so much of it. She left her ma's room and passed Butch in the hall. She didn't make eye contact with him. She went to her room, took out her makeup case, and went to work on her black and blue face.
Hey, sis.
Butch said from the entryway. She glanced at him in the mirror, then went back to applying base over the stinging bruises.
You're a good kid, sis. You do all the right things.
Twana cocked her head to the side and fixed Butch with a suspicious glance.
Just saying.
Butch said.
Don't be like me.
I don't plan to.
Twana said. Butch nodded.
Look, Butch, we gotta talk.
Butch looked up.
About what?
About Ma. She's dying. We gotta get her off the stuff. We gotta do right by her.
I never sold no smack,
Butch said.
But if we don't try something different, something big, we're gonna lose her.
You got something in mind?
I do, but we'll talk later. I gotta get to school.
Butch mustered up an awkward smile.
You do that.
Don't do nothing stupid, Butchie. I'm gonna get us out of this, but I'm gonna need you to help me.
Butch nodded and scratched the back of his head. Twana finished her makeup. He watched for a while, then left. After doing what she could to hide her bruises, Twana snatched up her backpack and went out into the overcast day. She took in a deep breath of polluted air and started walking her daily 1.5-mile trek to school. Shanna Perkinson, with her eyes magnified by a pair of far-sighted spectacles, looked down her nose at Twana as she hung her backpack in her locker.
What's that smell?
Shanna asked, wincing. Twana put a hand over the lipstick case pendant under her shirt and forced a smile.
What smell?
You smell like a dead mouse or something.
Keep your nose out of my business,
Twana said. She gathered up her science books and headed to class. It was Frog Day. Mr. Murphy wore a white lab coat. He stood at the front of the science room, a long wooden pointer in one hand. As he lectured, he aimed the pointer at a set of anatomical diagrams fixed with magnets to a whiteboard at the front of the class. Earlier in the semester, Mr. Murphy had held up one of the 100 or so bottles he kept on the shelves in the back room, a small glass jar filled with formaldehyde and a dead frog.
If you're really good,
Mr. Murphy had said,
I will let you cut one of these open someday.
Most of the kids had winced at the promise. Some of them had smiled, practically rubbing their hands together in glee. Mr. Murphy stopped lecturing and put his hands on his hips. He cocked his head to one side and panned across the class with his blue eyes, his mouth stern and fixed.
Can I get 2 volunteers?
A few kids raised their hands. He pointed out a duo of students, then pointed at a long table at the front of the room, lined with row after row of jars, each containing a frog.
Hand them out, if you please.
As his volunteers went to work placing a jar on each desk, Mr. Murphy told the rest of the students to open up their dissection kits. Twana untaped her kit and unrolled it on her desk. She used a white towel in the kit to cover her work surface. She opened a little plastic bag of tools, a wooden plank, a handful of push pins, a scalpel, a pair of tweezers, and a tongue depressor. After his volunteers had finished distributing the frogs, Mr. Murphy explained the process of conducting a frog autopsy. Twana thought that dissecting a frog would gross her out, but she actually found the whole process interesting. First, following Mr. Murphy's orders, she pinned the frog to her wood plank, belly up, driving the push pins through its appendages and spreading it out like a starfish. She used the scalpel in her kit to slice open the frog's belly from head to crotch. One by one, with Mr. Murphy as a guide, she explored the frog's inner parts, its lungs, its heart, its intestines. As she worked, she realized that the stench that had wafted around the room when the students had first drawn their specimens out of the formaldehyde had flagged off. She thought about Shanna and her comment about smelling a dead mouse. She touched the little lipstick case-sized bulge under her shirt and looked around the room. She'd been wearing Bieber's finger for over 12 hours now. Twana hadn't noticed the smell. She'd grown used to its company. But if the finger drew the wrong attention, she didn't know if she could come up with a convincing explanation. She waited for Mr. Murphy to turn his back, then took the pendant off her neck. She opened the plastic tube, checked both ways, and poured in enough formaldehyde for her specimen jar to submerge the finger. She snapped the lipstick case shut and restrung it onto her gold chain. She'd have to seal the case later with superglue. But for now, she had taken care of the foul smell and acted to preserve the finger at the same time. Pleased with her ingenuity, she finished up with her frog autopsy. At the end of class, Mr. Murphy walked the room, row by row, his pointer in one hand and a slate in the other. He checked each student's project and wrote grades on his slate. He lingered for an extra minute at Twana's desk, looking over her work.
"This is a fine autopsy,"
he said. Twana smiled up at him.
"Your incisions are clean. Your dissections are precise. You have talent, young lady."
Twana beamed and touched the little bulge at her chest beneath her shirt. Although Twana couldn't see it, she knew that Mr. Murphy wrote a big fat A next to her name on his slate.
Your head up in the clouds now. Best take your temperature. You're either ill or you're high now. I got your stasis, got your diagnosis. I wrote my cases, good prognosis. It ain't no crisis. I got your analysis, I got your fixes for your fixation.
Let's talk about today's song. I wrote My Love is Terminal as part of a promo album for the board game Chops. You can get the board game in my online store at craignibo.com. It's one of those songs that in my mind could easily have been performed by a band like the Five Fingers, or maybe even Bieber himself. It's got that kind of vibe. By the way, all characters in this story are fictional. Any resemblance to real people in nature or in name is purely coincidental. Anyways, I thought this song fit the tone of the story perfectly. Well, we're off and running on a new 13-episode adventure. I'm so glad you've decided to come along on this journey with me. Trust me, you won't believe where this story is going. It's going to be a wild ride, and I hope you'll stick around for every twist and turn. If you enjoyed today's episode, remember to share the podcast with friends, leave a review, and consider becoming a backer at patreon.com/terrifyinglies. Your support means the world and keeps this show alive. Until next time, I bid you sweet dreams, or should I say, sweet nightmares.
This has been the Terrifying Lies podcast. Please come again. You're welcome here.